At some point, and nobody knows exactly when your heart is going to stop, your brain is going to go dark. And the you that is reading these words right now is going to stop existing in the way it currently does. We have been trying to understand what happens next for as long as humans have existed. And what science has discovered, and what the people who came closest to death is report, will change how you think about the one thing nobody wants to think about. Let's start with what actually happens to your body, because the biological process of dying is not what most people imagine. Death is not a moment, it's a process. Different parts of your body die at different times, and some parts survive much longer than you would expect. When your heart stops, your brain has roughly 4 to 6 minutes before irreversible damage begins. And what the brain does during those final minutes is one of the most remarkable and controversial discoveries in modern neuroscience. In 2023, researchers at the University of Michigan recorded a surge of brain activity in dying patients, activity levels higher than during normal waking consciousness. In the moments after the heart stopped, the brain became more active, not less. Scientists don't fully understand why, but this surge may be connected to something that millions of people have reported experiencing: the near-death experience. Approximately 4% of the population reports having had a near-death experience. That's hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And across cultures, across centuries, across people with wildly different beliefs, the reports are remarkably consistent. The most commonly reported elements include a feeling of profound peace, leaving the body and observing it from above, moving through a tunnel toward light, and encountering deceased loved ones. The feeling of peace is reported so consistently that it has its own scientific term, the NDE effect. People who have had NDEs consistently report that the experience felt more real than ordinary waking life, not less. And the out-of-body experience, where people report floating above their own body and observing the room, has produced some genuinely difficult-to-explain cases. Some patients have reported observing their own resuscitation from above and later described specific details about what medical staff said and did, details they could not have known from their position in the bed. Science has several explanations for NDEs, and none of them fully account for all the evidence. The oxygen deprivation theory suggests that the brain creates hallucinations as it runs out of oxygen, producing the tunnel, the light, and the peace. But this theory struggles to explain NDEs that occurred under general anesthesia, where the brain should have been completely suppressed. The honest scientific position is this: we don't know what NDEs are, we can't fully explain them, and the evidence suggests something significant is happening. Now, let's talk about what happens to your body after death, because this part is actually fascinating from a biological perspective. Your body doesn't stop being active after death. It begins an extraordinary process of transformation. The bacteria that lived inside you, helping you digest food and fight disease, continue living after you die. And they begin the process of breaking down the body, returning its nutrients to the soil. The atoms that make up your body right now have existed for billions of years and will continue to exist for billions more after you are gone. You are, in the most literal sense, made of stardust. And when you die, those atoms will become part of something else: trees, soil, water, other living things. Now, let's talk about how every major human civilization has answered the question of what happens after death. Ancient Egyptians believed death was a transition, not an ending, and spent enormous resources preparing for what came next. They believed the soul was weighed against a feather after death, and the outcome determined what came next. Ancient Greeks had a complex underworld with different destinations depending on how you lived. Hindu and Buddhist traditions describe reincarnation, the soul continuing in a new body, with the quality of the next life determined by actions in this one. Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, describe judgment and continuation in some form after death. What's remarkable is that virtually no human culture across history has believed that death is simply the end, nothing more. And here's where it gets philosophically interesting, because that universal intuition might tell us something important. Or it might simply reflect the fact that human brains struggle to imagine their own non-existence. Try right now to imagine not existing, genuinely not existing. No thoughts, no awareness, no experience of any kind. Every time you try, there's always a you doing the imagining, which makes genuine non-existence almost impossible to conceive of. Now let's talk about what modern science actually says about consciousness, because this is where the death question gets most complicated. Scientists do not fully understand what consciousness is or where it comes from. This is called the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains one of the greatest unsolved problems in all of science. We know consciousness is somehow produced by the brain, but we don't know how physical matter produces subjective experience. And if we don't understand how consciousness is produced, we can't say with certainty what happens to it when the brain stops. The materialist view, the dominant scientific view, says consciousness is entirely produced by the brain and ends when the brain dies. But a significant minority of scientists, including some of the most respected researchers in neuroscience and physics, disagree. Some physicists have proposed that consciousness may be a fundamental property of the universe like mass or charge, rather than something the brain produces. If consciousness is fundamental rather than produced, then the question of what happens to it after death becomes genuinely open. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and anyone who tells you they know with certainty is overstating what the evidence supports. Now, let's talk about something that death research has consistently found, and that changes how most people think about dying itself. Most people are far more afraid of dying than of being dead. And research on the actual dying process consistently finds that it is far less painful and frightening than most people imagine. The brain releases natural pain-relieving and mood-elevating chemicals during the dying process, including endorphins and possibly DMT. Hospice workers, people who have sat with hundreds of dying patients, consistently report that the dying process is often peaceful and even beautiful. Many dying patients report a period of unusual clarity and peace in the days before death, sometimes called terminal lucidity. People with severe dementia who haven't recognized family members for years suddenly becoming completely lucid hours before death. Science cannot currently explain why this happens, but it happens consistently enough that hospice workers expect it. Now, let's talk about what death research has found about how people live differently after confronting death. People who have had near-death experiences report dramatic and consistent changes in how they live afterward. Less fear of death, greater compassion for others, reduced interest in material possessions, increased sense of purpose and meaning. And people who work closely with death, hospice workers, palliative care nurses, grief counselors, report similar shifts in perspective. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Rome had a practice called memento mori. Remember that you will die as a tool for living better. The idea was that regularly confronting your mortality, not avoiding it, was the path to a more meaningful and less anxious life. Modern psychology has found that the Stoics were right. Terror management theory shows that unconscious awareness of death drives enormous amounts of human behavior. Making it conscious, actually thinking about death, deliberately reduces its unconscious power over your decisions. Now, here's the part of this that I find most remarkable and most personally useful. When people are asked at the end of their lives what they regret, the answers are remarkably consistent. Nobody says they wish they had worked more. Nobody says they wish they had spent more time on their phone. The most common regrets are not spending enough time with people they loved, not being true to themselves, and not saying important things that needed to be said. Death has a way of clarifying what actually matters. And the view from the end of life is remarkably consistent about what that is. The people, the experiences, the things you said and didn't say. The authentic life you lived or didn't live. Not the things you owned, not the status you accumulated, not the arguments you won. Now, here's what I think is the most important thing this entire subject teaches us. We don't know what happens after death, and we may never know, but we know with complete certainty what happens before it. Life happens before it, and the people who have come closest to death are unanimous about what life should contain. Connection, authenticity, presence, saying the things that need to be said, being with the people who matter. The question of what happens after death is genuinely open, but the question of what to do before it has a remarkably clear answer. And we know this not from philosophy or religion, but from the people who have actually looked death in the face and come back. And from the dying who see clearly what mattered and what didn't in a way that is simply not possible from inside an ordinary day. At some point, your heart is going to stop, and nobody knows exactly when. And what happens next, nobody can tell you with certainty. But what happens before it, that part is entirely up to you. And the people who have come closest to the end are unanimous that it matters more than anything else.